I never imagined that watching my sister walk down the aisle in my wedding dress would be the moment I finally understood the difference between love and currency. The morning light through the drawing room windows had that particular quality of early autumn, golden, slanting, catching dust motes that danced like tiny accusers in the air. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the way Mother had taught me, while the solicitor's voice droned on about settlements and agreements. Edward stood by the mantelpiece, one hand resting on the marble with studied casualness, his profile sharp against the wallpaper's burgundy damask. He looked every inch the gentleman, tall, fair-haired, with that easy confidence that comes from never having wanted for anything. My younger sister, Constance, perched on the edge of the settee, her eyes darting between us like a sparrow watching for crumbs. I remember thinking how strange it was that love could be measured in pounds sterling and acres of land. The engagement had been announced in June, just after the roses bloomed. Edward had courted me with all the proper attentions. Afternoon calls, chaperoned walks through the park, his voice low and warm as he spoke of our future together. I was 23, considered rather old for a first engagement, and perhaps I had been too eager to believe in the romance of it all. Too willing to overlook the way his eyes would glaze over when I spoke of books, or how his questions about father's estate always seemed more animated than his inquiries about my own thoughts. Constance had just turned 18 that spring, all dimples and golden curls, with Mother's porcelain complexion and none of my unfortunate height or serious disposition. She had a way of filling rooms with laughter, of making even the dullest conversation sparkle. I had loved her fiercely, the way elder sisters do, protective and proud in equal measure. The first crack appeared at dinner one evening in late July. Mother had been discussing my dowry with unusual specificity. £5,000, the house in Kent, certain shares that father had accumulated. Edward's attention sharpened like a hound catching a scent. Then Mother mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Constance's portion would be considerably larger. Father's recent investments had prospered beyond expectation, she explained, and he intended to settle £12,000 on his younger daughter, along with the London house. I watched Edward's face across the table. The candlelight caught something cold in his expression, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. But I didn't imagine how his visits became less frequent afterward, or how often I would find him and Constance laughing together in the garden, their heads bent close over some shared amusement. The betrayal, when it came, was conducted with perfect propriety. Edward called on father one morning in September and, with great regret, explained that he had come to realise his heart belonged to another. The engagement was dissolved with the minimum of scandal. These things happen, people said. Better to discover the truth before the wedding than after. And wasn't it romantic, they whispered, how young Constance and Edward had fallen so desperately in love. One could hardly blame them for the urgency of their feelings. The wedding was set for October. I sat in the second pew of St. Mary's, watching my sister float down the aisle in the gown that had been altered from my measurements to fit her smaller frame. The lace at the sleeves still bore the marks of where it had been let out, then taken in again. Mother sat beside me, her face radiant with satisfaction. She had always preferred Constance's vivacity to my quieter nature, had never quite forgiven me for being born first when clearly the younger daughter was better suited for making an advantageous match. Edward's eyes never once drifted to where I sat. He gazed at Constance with what appeared to be genuine devotion, though I now understood how easily such expressions could be manufactured when £12,000 hung in the balance. The breakfast afterward was held at our house, or rather, what had been our house, though it would soon belong to Constance and her new husband. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, accepting condolences disguised as congratulations, my smile fixed and brittle as porcelain. The wedding cake sat on the sideboard, white and towering, decorated with sugar roses that would melt on the tongue and leave nothing but sweetness behind. I found myself in Father's study, my hand resting on his desk. He had died the previous winter, suddenly, leaving Mother to manage his affairs with the help of his solicitor, Mr. Blackwell. The room still smelled of his pipe tobacco, that particular blend of cherry and oak that had meant safety and home throughout my childhood. That was when I noticed the letter. It lay half hidden beneath a stack of papers, addressed to me in Father's distinctive hand. The seal was broken, the paper worn as though it had been read many times. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, and with each line I read, something inside me grew very still and very cold. "My dearest daughter," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I fear my greatest worry has come to pass. Your mother has never understood you as I have, never valued the keen mind and loyal heart that make you far more precious than any amount of money could measure. I have made arrangements that she knows nothing of. The settlements she believes will go to your sister are, in fact, merely a fraction of what I have set aside. The true inheritance, the bulk of my estate, including the properties, the investments, and a sum of £30,000, is held in trust for you alone, to be released on your 24th birthday or upon your marriage, whichever comes first." The letter continued, but I had stopped breathing. My 24th birthday was in 3 weeks. I read it again, then once more, making certain I had not misunderstood. Father had created 2 separate wills, one that Mother had been shown, dividing his estate as she expected, and the true will, filed with Mr. Blackwell's firm, that gave me everything. He had suspected, even then, that Mother would favour Constance. He had wanted to protect me from being married for what little I was thought to have, or dismissed entirely for lacking a substantial portion. How ironic, I thought, that his protection had achieved the opposite. Edward had rejected me for being too poor, only to marry my sister for wealth that didn't exist. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my bodice, feeling the paper rest against my heart like armour. Then I returned to the wedding breakfast, to the champagne and laughter and the sight of Edward's hand possessive on Constance's waist, and I smiled. Not the tight, painful smile I had worn all day, but something genuine, something that held the shape of things to come. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange, dreamlike state. I took tea with Constance and Edward in their new home, the home I had once imagined would be mine, and listened to Constance chatter about redecorating while Edward calculated expenses with barely concealed anxiety. The £12,000, I learned from careful listening, had already been largely committed to paying his debts and making improvements to his family's estate. They had spent money they didn't yet have, confident that the settlement would cover everything and more. I visited Mr. Blackwell's office alone, taking a hired cab so no one would question my destination. He was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the methodical manner of someone who had spent a lifetime handling other people's secrets. When I showed him Father's letter, he nodded slowly. "I wondered when you would discover this," he said. "Your father made me promise not to contact you directly, fearing your mother would intercept any correspondence. He trusted that you would find your way to the truth when the time was right. The trust can be released early, on my marriage," I said carefully. "But I am not married, and my birthday is still weeks away." Correct on both counts. Mr. Blackwell steepled his fingers. However, there is one other provision. If circumstances arise that require immediate action to protect your interests, I am authorised to make the trust public at my discretion. I met his eyes. And would you say that my sister's husband marrying her under the false belief that she possesses wealth that actually belongs to me constitutes such circumstances? The smallest smile touched his lips. I would say that constitutes fraud, Miss Thornton, and I would be duty-bound to correct it. The announcement appeared in the Times on a Thursday morning. A simple legal notice, the kind most people skip over, informing all interested parties that the estate of the late Mr. James Thornton had been settled according to his true and final will, with the bulk of the inheritance passing to his elder daughter, Miss Catherine Thornton, as of her recent 24th birthday. I was taking breakfast with Mother when she read it. I watched the blood drain from her face, watched her hands begin to shake so badly that her teacup clattered against its saucer. "This cannot be," she whispered. "James promised," the will said. "Father made 2 wills," I said quietly. "You knew about the first. I know about the second." The confrontation that followed was brief and bitter. Mother had known, of course. Mr. Blackwell had approached her weeks after Father's death with questions about certain discrepancies, and she had lied, produced the false will, claimed that Father's mind had been unclear at the end. She had wanted Constance to have everything, had believed that my serious nature and plain features meant I would never attract a suitable husband regardless of my portion. Better to give the money to the daughter who could use it to secure a brilliant match. And it had worked, after a fashion. Constance had secured a match, just not in the way Mother had intended. The scandal rippled through society like a stone thrown into still water. The precise details were never publicly discussed. One didn't air such matters openly, but word spread nonetheless. Edward had married the wrong sister. The fortune he'd calculated on didn't exist. His debts remained, now compounded by the expenses of a wedding and household he couldn't afford. I received a letter from Constance 3 days after the announcement. Her handwriting, usually so carefree and flowing, looked cramped and desperate. "Catherine," it began. "Please, you must help us. Edward says we are ruined, that the creditors will take everything. Mother told us about your inheritance. Surely you can spare something for your own sister, for the sake of the love we once shared." I read it standing by the window of my new sitting room. I had taken apartments on my own, scandalous for an unmarried woman, but perfectly acceptable for one of independent means. The afternoon light slanted through the glass, exactly as it had in the old drawing room, but everything else had changed. I could have helped them. The £30,000 was more than enough to settle Edward's debts and still leave me comfortably situated. A generous sister would have done so without question. A kind-hearted woman would have forgiven the betrayal and the humiliation, would have understood that Constance had been young and foolish, swept up in Edward's calculated courtship. But I was no longer the woman who had sat silent and compliant while her life was dismantled piece by piece. I composed my reply with care, weighing each word. "Dear Constance," I wrote, "I have given your request considerable thought. You ask me to help for the sake of the love we once shared, and I find myself wondering what form that love took. Was it love when you wore my wedding dress? Was it love when you laughed in the garden with the man who had promised himself to me? You have made your choice, just as Edward made his. He married you for money that didn't exist, and now you both must live with the consequences of that calculation." I paused, the pen hovering over the paper. Then I continued, "But I am not entirely without feeling. I will make you an offer, the same offer that Edward once made to me. I will give you exactly what you are worth. You may have the £5,000 that everyone believed was my portion, the amount that Edward found so disappointing when he first learned of it. That should be sufficient to settle the most pressing debts. As for the rest, I suggest that your husband find employment. I understand that younger sons of good families can sometimes secure positions in trade or the colonial service, where their connections still carry some weight. The money will be available on one condition. You must both acknowledge publicly that Edward married you believing you were the wealthier sister, and that this belief was mistaken. I want the truth known, not whispered in drawing rooms, but stated plainly. Only then will I release the funds. I remain, as always, your sister." The reply came faster than I expected. They would not do it, could not do it. The humiliation would be complete, Edward's position in society utterly destroyed. Better to sell the house, dismiss the servants, retreat to the country, and hope that time would dull the scandal's edge. I felt a twinge of something that might have been regret. Then I remembered standing in the church, watching Constance say vows that should have been mine, and the feeling passed. They sold the London house within the month. Edward took a position with the East India Company, one of those vague administrative roles that required him to relocate to Calcutta. Constance went with him, of course. Mother, her own position in society now precarious, moved to Bath to live with her sister, where the scandal would be less immediate and her reduced circumstances less apparent. I remained in London. The months that followed were unlike anything I had known before. I discovered that independence had a taste, sharp and strange, like the first sip of wine before one acquires the palate for it. I attended lectures at the Royal Society, where they had recently begun admitting female observers. I invested a portion of my inheritance in a publishing house run by a shrewd woman named Mrs. Hartley, who specialised in novels written by and for women. I travelled to Paris for 3 months, unaccompanied except for a paid companion, and saw paintings in museums that made me understand what beauty could mean when untethered from duty. Men still courted me, of course. £30,000 is a powerful incentive for attention. But I had learned to recognise the calculations behind the compliments, the way eyes would sharpen when the conversation turned to finances. I accepted none of them. Perhaps I would marry some day, but it would be on my own terms, in my own time, or not at all. The one person I did not hear from was Edward. Constance wrote occasionally, brief, stilted letters that spoke of heat and strange customs and a pervasive loneliness. She never directly asked for money again, but the need hung between every line. I sent small amounts sometimes, enough to ease the worst of their circumstances, but never enough to restore what they had lost. It was not kindness that motivated me exactly, but a recognition that Constance had been as much a victim of Edward's calculations as I had been, even if she had participated willingly in my downfall. 2 years after the wedding, I received word that Edward had died of a fever in Calcutta. Constance returned to England a widow, thin and worn, her golden hair dulled and her dimples less pronounced. She came to see me on a grey afternoon in November, and we sat in my drawing room drinking tea like strangers who shared only the faintest memory of intimacy. "I wanted you to know I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. I was young and foolish, and Mother told me that Edward truly loved me, that you would understand eventually. I believed what I wanted to believe. I studied her face, searching for the sister I had once known. She looked older than her 20 years, marked by loss and distance and the hard edges of consequences. "I know," I said. "Can you forgive me?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with hope and desperation. I thought about forgiveness, about what it meant to release anger and hurt. I thought about the woman I had been, sitting silent and compliant in that church, and the woman I had become. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Perhaps someday, but not yet." She nodded, unsurprised. "Will you help me? I have nothing, Catherine. Edward's debts consumed everything, even the widow's portion." "I will help you," I said, and watched relief flood her features. "But not with money. I will secure you a position as a companion to an elderly lady I know in Kent. It's respectable work, and she's kind. You'll have room and board, a small salary, and the chance to build a new life on your own merits rather than someone else's fortune." The hope in her eyes flickered and dimmed, but she nodded again. She had learned, as I had, that pride is a luxury one cannot always afford. After she left, I stood by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. Somewhere in the city, my sister would be starting over with nothing but her own efforts to sustain her. Somewhere else, my mother sat in Bath, bitter and diminished, sustained by an allowance I sent monthly but would not increase. The house in Kent, the one that had been meant for my dowry and then for Constance's marriage, sat empty except for a caretaker, waiting for me to decide its future. I had won, if winning was the right word for what had transpired. I had my inheritance, my independence, and my dignity restored. Edward was dead. His calculations come to nothing. Constance had learned that beauty and charm are temporary currencies. Mother had discovered that manipulation has its limits. But I had learned something too. Revenge, real revenge, is not a moment of triumph, but a long, slow unwinding of consequences. It's watching people live with the choices they made, the prices they must pay, while you go on building a life they can no longer touch or diminish. It's the freedom that comes from being underestimated, dismissed, and then proven spectacularly correct in your quiet estimation of your own worth. The rain continued to fall, soft and steady, washing the city clean. I turned from the window and moved toward my desk, where correspondence waited, and a manuscript from Mrs. Hartley's publishing house needed my review. Tomorrow I would attend a lecture on astronomy. Next week, I might take the train to Brighton for the sea air. The month after that, who could say? My life stretched before me, unwritten and entirely my own, and I realised with sudden clarity that this was what Father had wanted for me all along. Not revenge, but freedom. The revenge had simply been the price others paid for trying to take that freedom away. I sat down at my desk and began to write. The scratch of pen on paper, the only sound in the quiet room, and for the first time in years, I felt something very close to peace. The inheritance had bought me many things, but the greatest gift it gave me was this: the knowledge that I had never needed anyone to validate my worth, only the means to prove it.